Mind trigger, 27 psychological tactics that make people do exactly what you want. Part 2, controlling the conversation. Tactics 10 to 18. You've learned to read people. Now comes the shift. Reading is passive. What follows is active. The art of shaping a conversation so precisely, so invisibly, that by the time it ends, the other person believes every conclusion was their own idea. This is where influence stops being observation and becomes architecture. Tactic number 10, the frame master. Whoever sets the frame controls the game. What it is, every conversation happens inside a frame, an invisible context that determines how everything said within it is interpreted. The frame master understands that the person who sets that context before the conversation controls everything that follows. A frame is not an argument. It is the lens through which all arguments are evaluated. Control the lens, and you control what people see and what conclusions feel natural to reach. The psychology behind it. Cognitive framing is one of the most powerful and well-documented phenomena in psychology. The same information, presented in two different frames, produces dramatically different responses, not because people are irrational, but because context is inseparable from content. The brain doesn't evaluate information in a vacuum. It evaluates information relative to a reference point, and the reference point is the frame. The classic example, a surgery with a 90% survival rate and a surgery with a 10% mortality rate, are mathematically identical. Yet studies consistently show that people respond to the first option with far more confidence. The frame, survival versus mortality, changes the emotional experience of the same data. This isn't a quirk of medical statistics. It applies to every human interaction. The frame determines what is relevant, what is normal, what is alarming, and what is desirable. Set the frame first, and everything your counterpart says afterward will be evaluated inside the reality you constructed. Real-life example. Two lawyers were negotiating a settlement. Lawyer A opened by saying, "My client is open to a reasonable settlement somewhere in the range of $400,000 to $500,000. Lawyer B, who had read extensively on framing, did something different. Before any numbers were discussed, she spent the opening 10 minutes of the meeting establishing the legal precedents, cases where juries had awarded between $800,000 and $1.2 million for similar situations. She did this calmly, matter-of-factly, as if simply providing context. Then she made her opening number, $650,000. The opposing counsel, whose internal target had been $350,000 before the meeting, found themselves negotiating from a completely different psychological floor. The final settlement was $520,000, far above what the opposing side had considered possible. Lawyer B never argued. She didn't need to. She had simply built the room before the negotiation began. How to use it, step by step. Step 1. Set the frame before the conversation officially begins. The most powerful framing happens in the opening moments, in small talk, in the way you set up the meeting, in the first thing you say. These moments feel low stakes to most people, which is exactly why they are unguarded. Use them. Step 2. Establish your anchors early. An anchor is the first number, idea, or reference point introduced into a conversation. It disproportionately influences everything that follows. Always anchor high if you want the negotiation to move in your direction. Always anchor with the most favorable context if you want your position to appear reasonable. Step 3. Name the frame explicitly when it benefits you. Sometimes the most powerful move is to openly declare the frame. I want to make sure we're looking at this as a long-term partnership, not a one-time transaction. By naming the frame, you make it the agreed-upon reality of the conversation. Step 4. Reject unfavorable frames without attacking them. If someone else tries to set a frame that disadvantages you, don't argue with it directly. That gives it energy. Simply decline to enter it. Respond from your own frame, as if the competing one doesn't exist. I hear what you're saying. From where I sit, the real question is, and redirect. Step 5. Reframe consistently. A frame is not set once. It requires maintenance. If the conversation starts drifting into unfavorable territory, reframe calmly and consistently, not defensively. Simply reestablish the lens. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. Notice when conversation begins with a lot of scene setting that you didn't ask for. When someone is providing extensive context before making their actual request, they are likely building a frame designed to make that request seem reasonable or even inevitable. Ask yourself, who chose this context and why this context rather than another one? Naming the frame to yourself breaks its power considerably. You can then choose whether to accept it or to offer a counterframe. Tactic number 11, the echo chamber. Make them feel so understood they can't resist you. What it is? The echo chamber is the deliberate practice of reflecting someone's own thoughts, feelings, and words back to them in a way that makes them feel completely and profoundly understood. Not mimicry, not flattery, something more sophisticated. The experience of being genuinely heard, perhaps for the first time. When a person feels truly understood, their defenses dissolve, their trust opens, and their resistance to your influence drops to near zero. Understanding is not just a social grace. It is a master key, the psychology behind it. The need to be understood is among the deepest and most consistently unmet of all human psychological needs. Research in interpersonal psychology consistently shows that perceived understanding, feeling that another person genuinely grasps your perspective, is the single most important factor in building trust and rapport. More important than shared interests, more important than time spent together, more important than even shared values. The reason is neurological. When we feel understood, the brain's threat response system, the amygdala, quiets down. The social brain activates instead. We become open, generous, and collaborative. We stop defending and start connecting. This means that the fastest and most reliable path to influence is not to make a compelling argument. It is to make the other person feel so understood that they want to move toward you, because moving toward you feels safe. Real-life example. A customer called the service line furious. He'd been overcharged 3 months in a row, had called twice before, and nothing had been fixed. By the time he reached Maya, the representative, he was past anger and into contempt. He opened with, "I've spoken to 2 useless people already, and nothing has changed, so I'm not expecting much from you either." A less skilled representative would have immediately launched into apologies and explanations. Maya did neither. She said, "I hear you. You've taken time out of your day, 3 times now, to fix a problem that should have been fixed the first time, and you still have to do it again. That's genuinely frustrating, and it's completely reasonable that you don't expect this conversation to be any different." Silence on the line. Then, "Yeah, exactly." Something in him released. She had said back to him, precisely, without defense, exactly what he was feeling. He wasn't right or wrong in that moment. He was simply heard. From that point forward, the conversation was collaborative. She fixed the issue, and he ended the call by thanking her specifically, asking for her name, and saying she was the first person there who actually listened. She hadn't done anything dramatically different. She had simply made him feel understood before she tried to solve anything. That sequence changed everything. How to use it, step by step. Step 1. Stop preparing your response while they're still talking. This is the most common failure of listening. Most people spend the time someone else is speaking preparing what they will say next. This means they absorb perhaps 30% of what's actually said. Full understanding requires full attention. Listen to the end, then respond. Step 2. Reflect the emotion, not just the content. Most people respond to the content of what someone says, the facts, the events, the request. Echo chamber goes deeper. Reflect the emotion underneath the content. That must have been frustrating. It sounds like you felt like you weren't being taken seriously. Emotional reflection creates connection that content reflection cannot. Step 3. Use their exact words. When you reflect someone's language back to them, literally their words, their phrasing, it creates a powerful sense of being understood without any apparent effort. It feels uncanny. It feels like you're thinking the same thoughts. This is not a trick. It is attunement. Step 4. Resist the urge to fix, advise, or redirect too early. The move to solutions too quickly signals that you weren't fully listening, that you were listening for the moment you could respond. Sit with the understanding longer than feels natural. The solution will land far better on soil that has been properly prepared. Step 5. Confirm before moving forward. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. And then summarize. Then ask, is that right? This simple act makes people feel heard at a level they almost never experience. It builds trust faster than almost any other behavior. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. The danger of the echo chamber is that it exploits our most genuine psychological need, the need to be understood. When someone reflects your feelings and thoughts back to you with suspicious accuracy and consistency, be aware that you may be in the presence of a skilled operator. The feeling of being understood is so powerful, so rare, and so welcome that it almost always produces disproportionate trust and loyalty. Ask yourself, does this person understand me? Or have they simply learned to sound like they do? True understanding reveals itself over time and across contexts. Performed understanding often disappears the moment it stops being useful. Tactic number 12, the strategic pause. Silence is the most underestimated weapon in any conversation. What is? Most people are terrified of silence. They rush to fill it, to smooth it over, to prevent the discomfort it creates. The strategic pause is the deliberate use of silence as an active tool to create pressure, to invite disclosure, to signal authority, and to give your previous words maximum weight. The person who controls silence controls the room, and it costs absolutely nothing. The psychology behind it. Human beings have a deep, neurologically rooted discomfort with social silence. Studies show that silences of just 4 seconds in a conversation produce measurable anxiety in participants. They begin to question their relationship with the other person, their own behavior, and what the silence means. This anxiety almost always produces action, disclosure, concession, emotional revelation, or a change in position. This response is automatic and almost universal. We are wired as social animals to interpret silence as a signal of disapproval, of danger, of disconnection, and we are compelled, with extraordinary urgency, to repair it. The person who understands this can simply stop talking at the right moment and allow the other person's own discomfort to do the work. Real-life example. A hiring manager named Robert was negotiating salary with a candidate he very much wanted to hire. The candidate set her number, $95,000. It was above the budgeted range, but not dramatically so. Robert did not immediately respond. He looked at her steadily, made brief notes, and said nothing for approximately 6 seconds. 6 seconds is an eternity in conversation. The candidate's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty. Then she said, I understand that might be on the higher end. I'm certainly open to discussing the full compensation package. Robert had not pushed back. He had not negotiated. He had simply allowed the silence to create pressure that she then moved to relieve by preemptively weakening her own position. He ended up hiring her at $88,000. She accepted readily, relieved that the tension had resolved. He had not said a single thing. The silence had done all the work. How to use it? Step by step. Step 1. Ask your question, then stop. Most people ask a question and then immediately start filling the space with qualifications, explanations, or follow-up questions. Ask the question, then be silent. Wait for the full answer. The discomfort you feel waiting is far smaller than the discomfort the other person feels not answering. Step 2. After making a strong point, pause. Silence after a strong statement gives that statement room to land, to echo in the other person's mind without being immediately covered by new information. The pause says, that matters. Take it seriously. Step 3. After hearing something significant, pause before responding. A pause before you respond signals that you are thinking genuinely, carefully about what was just said. This signals intelligence and seriousness. It also prevents reactive responses that you might regret. Step 4. In negotiations, after stating your position, go silent. This is the most direct application. State your position, then stop talking. The first person to speak after a position is stated is almost always the one who will make the concession. Don't let that be you. Step 5. Practice the discomfort. The pause feels unnatural because we have been conditioned to treat silence as failure. Practice holding silence in everyday conversations first, until the discomfort becomes familiar and manageable. Once the anxiety no longer controls you, you control it. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. When you notice silence following your statement, especially in a negotiation or high-stakes conversation, recognize it as a tool, not a response. Do not fill it with concessions or qualifications you didn't intend to make. Take a breath. Let the silence be shared. If you feel compelled to speak, ask a question rather than offering a concession. What are your thoughts? Gives you information. I could go lower. Gives away your position. Tactic number 13, the Socratic hook. Ask questions until they convince themselves. What is? The most resistant people in the world cannot be pushed into agreement, but they can be led there through a sequence of questions that guides their own thinking toward the conclusion you need them to reach. The Socratic hook is the art of asking questions instead of making statements. Questions that progressively narrow the space of logical options until the other person arrives, on their own, at exactly the position you wanted them to hold. Because a belief someone arrived at themselves is infinitely stronger than a belief they were told to have. The psychology behind it. Psychological reactance is the technical term for what happens when someone feels their freedom is being threatened, when they feel pushed, pressured, or cornered. The reaction is automatic and fierce. They push back, not because your argument is wrong, but because the act of being told what to think triggers resistance as a defense of autonomy. Questions bypass this entirely. A question is not a threat to autonomy. It is an invitation to think. And thinking, when guided skillfully, produces conclusions. When a person reaches a conclusion through their own thinking process, they experience it as their own idea. They own it. They defend it. They act on it. The Socratic method, named for the philosopher who perfected it in ancient Athens, is not a debate technique. It is a navigation system. You are not arguing. You are steering. Real-life example. A manager named Lisa needed her team to adopt a new and more time-consuming reporting process. She knew that if she simply announced the change, she'd face immediate resistance. Complaints about workload, questions about why the old system wasn't sufficient. Instead of announcing, she called a team meeting and asked 3 questions. First, what's your biggest frustration with the reporting we do now? The team lit up, a cascade of answers about errors, inconsistencies, and wasted time correcting mistakes downstream. Second, what would it look like if reporting were working perfectly? What would be different? More energy, more specificity. They described, almost exactly, the features of a new system she planned to implement. Third, if we could design a process that addressed those issues, would you be willing to try it? Even if it took a bit more time up front? Every hand went up. Every single person in the room had just argued for the change themselves. Lisa introduced the new system 30 minutes later as something inspired by our conversation today. There was no resistance. They had designed it. It was their idea. How to use it, step by step. Step 1. Know your destination before you begin. Socratic questioning only works if you know where you are leading. Clarify in your own mind. What conclusion do I need this person to reach? Then work backward. What sequence of honest, reasonable questions leads there? Step 2. Start with questions they can easily agree with. Open with questions where the honest answer already moves toward your position. Questions about problems, frustrations, goals, and values. Build agreement early. Agreement is momentum. Step 3. Ask questions, not loaded questions. The technique collapses immediately if the questions feel leading or manipulative. Each question should be genuine, something you'd actually want to know the answer to, and something the person can answer honestly in multiple ways. Guide the direction, not the answer. Step 4. Reflect their answers back to them as building blocks. So you're saying the current process wastes time and produces inconsistent results. Is that right? And if something addressed those two problems specifically, that would be worth trying. You're using their own words to construct the logical bridge to your conclusion. Step 5. Let them finish the sentence. As the conclusion approaches, leave space for them to say it themselves. Don't rush to complete the logic. The moment of arriving at the conclusion is powerful, and it needs to feel like there's warning. How to recognize when it's used against you. Be alert in any conversation that consists almost entirely of the other person asking you questions. Notice whether the questions are building toward a particular conclusion, whether each one seems to narrow your options slightly. The tell is the feeling of being led, of the conversation having a direction that you didn't choose. You can interrupt this process at any time by asking your own question. Where are you going with this? What conclusion are you building toward? Naming the process neutralizes it. Tactic number 14, the strategic agreement. Agree to lead. What it is? Disagreement is the most common and least effective tool of influence. When you disagree with someone, you activate their defenses, and a person in defensive mode is cognitively closed to new information. The strategic agreement is the counterintuitive practice of agreeing first, completely and genuinely, before introducing any redirection. Not fake agreement, real agreement with whatever is true. This lowers all defenses, creates deep rapport, and opens the space for a pivot that the other person accepts willingly because they trust you. The psychology behind it. The brain processes agreement as a social safety signal. When someone agrees with us, our threat response system quiets. Our cognitive openness increases. We become more receptive to subsequent information, not less, as might be feared. This is the paradox of strategic agreement. By yielding first, you gain more ground than you ever would by fighting for it. This principle is embedded in every sophisticated negotiation framework. In crisis negotiation, used by law enforcement to de-escalate hostage situations, the foundational rule is never to challenge a person's reality directly. You agree with what you can genuinely agree with. You validate the emotion even when you cannot validate the position. And from inside that agreement, you gently redirect. It works in hostage negotiations. It works in boardrooms. It works in marriages. It works because human psychology is the same in all of them. Real-life example. A client came to an architect furious. He had reviewed the initial designs and believed they were completely off brief. He stormed into the meeting saying the entire concept was wrong and that he didn't think the firm understood what he wanted at all. The architect, Victor, had a choice. He could defend his team's work, explain the design decisions, cite the brief, make his case. He would have been right to do so. He would also have been completely ineffective. Instead, he said, "You're right to push back. If the design doesn't feel like it reflects what you described to us, then we miss something important." Let's figure out exactly where the disconnect happened. The client's posture physically changed in the moment, from combative to collaborative, almost instantly. Victor then asked 3 questions about what the client had envisioned, and discovered that the disconnect was a single issue of spatial priority that had been misinterpreted at the brief stage. 90% of the design was exactly what was needed. By agreeing with the client's right to be frustrated rather than fighting his characterization of the work, Victor had purchased the collaborative space needed to find a real problem. The project moved forward that day. A defensive response would have produced weeks of hostility and possibly lost the client entirely. How to use it? Step by step. Step 1. Find the truth in their position. There is almost always something genuinely true in what someone is saying, even when they are angry, wrong on the details, or exaggerating. Locate that true element. Lead with agreement on it, not begrudgingly, genuinely. Step 2. Validate the emotion, regardless of the facts. Even if the facts are disputed, the emotion is real. Understand why you feel that way is always true. Feelings are facts. Validate the feeling explicitly before engaging with anything factual. Step 3. Agree fully and let it land. Don't immediately pivot after the agreement. Allow a beat. Let the agreement register and do its work. The person needs a moment to feel it before they're ready to move. Step 4. Pivot with and, not but. The word but psychologically erases everything that came before it. Understand your concern, but signals that the agreement was tactical rather than genuine. Use and instead. I completely understand that, and here's what I'd like to explore. The and maintains the agreement while introducing the redirection. Step 5. Move toward the shared goal. The most powerful redirect is toward something both parties want. We both want this project to be something you're genuinely proud of. Let's figure out what that takes. Shared goals dissolve individual positions. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. Watch for people who seem to agree with you unusually quickly and completely before pivoting to their actual position. Genuine agreement involves some thought, some nuance. Instant, total agreement on a complex point is almost always tactical. Notice whether the agreement is followed by a but disguised as an and be alert if you find yourself becoming very cooperative with someone who has just agreed with you on something important. Ask whether your openness is genuine or whether it's the product of a trigger that was just pulled. Tactic number 15, the anchored concession. Give less while making them feel they got more. What it is: every negotiation involves movement, positions shift, concessions are made, ground is given. The anchored concession is the practice of making your concessions appear far more generous than they actually are by controlling the anchor point, the initial reference position from which they are measured. If you start at $100 and move to $80, you have given $20. If you started at $130 and moved to $80, you appear to have given $50. The concession feels enormous. The outcome is identical. The psychology behind it. Anchoring is one of the most robust cognitive biases in behavioral economics. The first number introduced into any negotiation exerts a disproportionate influence on the final outcome, far beyond what logic would suggest. This happens because the human brain evaluates numerical options not in absolute terms, but relative to the anchor. The anchor becomes the reference point against which all subsequent numbers are measured. This means that the person who sets the anchor first controls the psychological frame of the entire negotiation. And the person who makes the first concession away from that anchor controls the perception of generosity, regardless of where the actual numbers land. Research by Adam Galinsky at Columbia Business School demonstrates that extreme first offers systematically lead to better final outcomes for the person making them, even when both parties know the offer is extreme. The anchor holds. Real-life example. A freelance designer named Alex was bidding on a project. His research told him the fair market rate for the work was approximately $8,000. His ideal outcome was $8,500. His walkaway point was $7,000. A less experienced version of Alex would have quoted $8,500 and hoped for the best. Experienced Alex quoted $12,000, confidently, with detailed justification. The client countered at $7,500. Alex expressed some resistance, then reluctantly came down at $9,000. The client pushed once more. Alex offered $8,200, as far as I can go, and included a small additional deliverable as a show of goodwill. The client accepted, feeling they had negotiated a $3,800 discount and received a bonus service. Alex had settled $700 above his target and well within his ideal range. Neither party felt cheated. The client felt they had won. Alex had structured the entire game. How to use it? Step by step. Step 1. Set an ambitious anchor. Your opening position should be toward the extreme of what can be justified. Not absurd, but ambitious. Be able to explain why. The explanation doesn't have to succeed. It just has to exist, so the anchor doesn't feel like a bluff. Step 2. Make concessions in decreasing increments. Your first concession should be moderate. Your second should be smaller. Your third smaller still. This pattern signals that you are approaching your limit, that you're giving more and more reluctantly. It makes each concession feel hard-won. Step 3. Never concede without something in return. Every concession you make should come with a reciprocal ask, even a small one. I can move on the price if we can lock in the timeline. This establishes that concessions are not free, and it maintains your leverage throughout. Step 4. Attach something of low cost to you, high value to them, to your final concession. This sweetener close. At the final concession, add a small additional element, something that costs you little but feels like a gesture of good faith. This creates the closing feeling of generosity and goodwill that seals the deal. Step 5. Know your walkaway point before you begin. The anchor in concession strategy requires confidence. Confidence requires knowing exactly where your floor is and being genuinely willing to walk away at that point. Without a real floor, you'll concede past it under pressure. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. Anytime you find yourself evaluating an offer primarily in terms of how much it has moved from the opening position, rather than in terms of the absolute value of what is on the table, you are inside an anchoring effect. Reframe. Ask, if I'd heard this number first, with no context, would it seem reasonable? Evaluate offers against an objective standard. Market rates, alternatives, actual costs, not against the anchor someone else set for you. Tactic number 16, the commitment ladder. Get small yes until the big one feels inevitable. What is? A large commitment, asked for all at once, feels enormous, and people resist enormous things instinctively. The commitment ladder is the practice of securing a series of small, low-stakes commitments that progressively build toward the large commitment you actually want. Each yes creates psychological momentum, activates the consistency bias, and makes the next yes easier, until the large commitment at the top of the ladder feels like a natural continuation of everything that came before. The psychology behind it. In 1966, psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser conducted what became one of the most cited studies in social psychology. They approached homeowners and asked them to display a large, ugly "drive carefully" sign in their front yard. The vast majority refused. But in a second group, they had first asked homeowners to display a small, tasteful window sticker about safe driving. Most agreed. 2 weeks later, when asked to display the large sign, 76% of this group complied, compared to just 17% of the first group. The only difference was the small commitment that preceded the large one. This is the foot in the door effect, and it works because of the human need for consistency. Once we agree to something, however small, We feel psychological pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. We don't want to see ourselves as the kind of person who goes back on their word. And so each yes makes the next yes feel not just easier, but necessary. Real-life example. A fundraiser named Sophie was trying to secure a significant donation, $25,000, from a potential donor named Mr. Patterson. She knew from experience that leading with that number would produce polite deflection. She didn't lead with the number. First, she invited him to a panel discussion on the cause, just to listen. He attended. When he arrived, she made a point of acknowledging him publicly as a friend of the organization. Small commitment. His presence associated with the cause. 2 months later, she asked if he'd be willing to serve on a small advisory committee. Nothing demanding, just 2 meetings per year. He agreed. Now he was officially affiliated. She asked him to speak at a small event. 5 minutes about why this cause mattered to people like him. He prepared and gave his talk. Now he had publicly declared his commitment to the cause in his own words. When Sophie sat down with him 4 months later and discussed a naming opportunity at the $25,000 level, Mr. Patterson had already answered the question of whether he was the kind of person who supported this cause. He'd answer it publicly, repeatedly, in his own words. He wrote the check. The ladder was already climbed. The top step was just the last one. How to use it? Step by step. Step 1. Map the ladder before you begin. Know where you are going and design the rungs backward from the top. What small commitments, when accumulated, make the final commitment feel consistent and natural? Step 2. Make the first rung genuinely easy. The first ask must be so small and so reasonable that refusal feels disproportionate. Agreement must feel effortless. This is the foot in the door. Step 3. Allow time between rungs. Each commitment needs time to settle into the person's self-concept before the next one is added. Don't rush the ladder. Patience here multiplies the effect dramatically. Step 4. Acknowledge each commitment explicitly. Name the commitments as they accumulate. Not manipulatively, but genuinely. Given your involvement so far, I wanted to talk to you about. This reminds the person of their own track record and activates the consistency pressure. Step 5. Make the final ask feel like a continuation, not a jump. Frame the large commitment as the natural next step, not a new and different thing. This would be a way to take what you're already doing to the next level. The ladder has to feel like one continuous path. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. Periodically audit your commitments. Ask yourself, how did I get here? If you find yourself involved in something, a relationship, an obligation, an agreement, that you cannot quite explain how you came to accept, trace the steps backward. You may find a ladder. You may discover that each step felt reasonable in isolation, but the cumulative distance traveled is far greater than you would have accepted if asked all at once. Awareness of a ladder doesn't always mean you should climb back down, but you deserve to know you're on one. Tactic number 17, the pattern interrupt. Break their script and rewrite the scene. What it is: every conversation runs on a script, a set of conditioned, automatic responses that people have rehearsed so thoroughly they no longer notice they're running them. The pattern interrupt is the deliberate introduction of something unexpected, a statement, a question, a behavior, a silence, that breaks the script completely. In the moment of confusion and reset that follows, the other person is maximally open to a new direction. That new direction is yours to provide. The psychology behind it. The human brain is an extraordinary pattern recognition machine. It processes familiar patterns automatically with minimal cognitive energy, essentially on autopilot. This is efficient. It is also a significant vulnerability. When the pattern breaks, the automatic processing system disengages and the conscious, attentive brain activates to figure out what just happened. This is called the orienting response, a moment of heightened attention and openness. In that moment of heightened openness, The first coherent new direction offered is received with dramatically less resistance than it would be under normal conditions. The defenses have been momentarily disarmed by the unexpected. The reset creates a window. This is used in everything from hypnotherapy, where pattern interrupts are a foundational induction technique, to elite sales training, negotiation, and high-stakes leadership. Real-life example. A customer service supervisor named Marcus was dealing with an irate caller, a man who had been screaming the same complaint on a loop for several minutes, working himself into an escalating frenzy. Marcus recognized it. The man was running a script: anger, demand, threat, repeat. Every response Marcus offered within that script, apologies, explanations, was simply absorbed into the loop and escalated. So Marcus stepped entirely outside the script. He said, in a calm and genuinely curious voice, "Can I ask you something? How long have you been dealing with this?" The man stopped mid-sentence. "What? How long has this been going on for you? Because you sound like someone who's been carrying this for a while." A pause. The loop broke. And then, about 6 weeks. Every time I call, I have to start over. The conversation changed completely from that point. The script had been running on its own momentum. The pattern interrupt dissolved it. And in the space that followed, Marcus was able to have an actual conversation, one that resolved the situation in 12 minutes. How to use it, step by step. Step 1. Recognize when a script is running. Scripts show up as repetition, escalation that isn't responding to your responses, or conversations that keep cycling back to the same point regardless of what you offer. When you feel stuck in a loop, you are probably inside a script. Step 2. Choose your interrupt. A good pattern interrupt is unexpected but not alarming. It can be a sincere, off-topic question, an unexpected agreement with something they didn't expect you to agree with, a shift in tone from formal to very direct, or vice versa. A long pause after they've expected a quick response. The key is that it must genuinely break the expected pattern. Step 3. Stay calm when you deliver it. The interrupt only works if you remain composed. A panicked or aggressive interrupt creates confusion without opening. A calm, confident interrupt creates a reset that you can step into. Step 4. Fill the reset immediately with your new direction. The window that opens after a pattern interrupt is brief, perhaps a few seconds. You need to have your new direction ready. A question works well here. Let me ask you something different. The question pulls the other person forward rather than pushing them. Step 5. Don't return to the old pattern. Once you've broken a script, don't let the conversation drift back into it. Stay in the new frame. If the script tries to reassert itself, interrupt it again. Warning. How to recognize when it's used against you. Be aware in conversations when something genuinely unexpected makes you feel suddenly uncertain or disoriented, and pay attention to what is offered in the moment that follows. The confused, reset state that a pattern interrupt creates is highly suggestible. You are unusually open to whatever direction is offered next. In that moment, slow down deliberately. The disorientation itself is the signal to be careful. Ask yourself, what just happened? And where is this person now? Try and take me. Tactic number 18, the confession trap. Tell a small truth to get a bigger one. What it is? People guard their real thoughts behind careful social filters. They say what is acceptable, not necessarily what is true. The confession trap is the technique of voluntarily revealing a small, somewhat vulnerable truth about yourself, a doubt, a failure, an insecurity, to create a powerful reciprocal pressure for the other person to match your level of honesty. It triggers the social norm of reciprocity in the domain of disclosure. You open, and they open. And sometimes, what they reveal is exactly what you needed to know. The psychology behind it. Social psychologist Erwin Altman's research on social penetration theory established that self-disclosure is fundamentally reciprocal. When one person discloses at a certain level of intimacy or vulnerability, The other person experiences strong social pressure to match that level. This pressure is not purely rational. It is deeply embedded in our social wiring. It feels wrong, on a primal level, to let someone be vulnerable with you and offer nothing in return. This dynamic means that voluntary vulnerability is, paradoxically, a form of power. The person who is willing to disclose first, who takes the social risk of showing something real, controls the depth of the conversation that follows. They set the level, and that level is contagious. Real-life example. A management consultant named Diana was struggling to get honest feedback from a new client organization. In her first few meetings, everyone was polished and positive, giving her the official narrative rather than the real situation. She needed the real one. She opened the next session differently. Before asking a single question, she said, "I want to be upfront with you. In my last major engagement, I missed something in the culture assessment that cost us 4 months. I came in too confident, too early. I'm trying very hard not to repeat that here, which means I need you to tell me things I might not want to hear." The room shifted. One senior manager, who had clearly been holding something back, leaned forward and said, "Since you're being honest, I'll tell you the real problem we've been avoiding talking about." What followed was the most useful conversation Diana had in the entire engagement. She got the truth because she offered a piece of it first. How to use it, step by step. Step 1. Choose a genuine disclosure. The confession must be real. Perform vulnerability is detectable and destroys trust instantly. Choose something true. A past mistake, a genuine uncertainty, a real limitation. Small and real is far more powerful than large and false. Step 2. Size it appropriately. The disclosure you offer should be slightly more vulnerable than you are comfortable with. Enough to feel real, but not so extreme that it overwhelms or frightens the other person. The goal is to model a level of honesty and invite reciprocation at that level, not to shock or alarm. Step 3. Time it strategically. Early in a relationship, strategic disclosure is an accelerant. It shortcuts the slow build of trust dramatically. In an established relationship, it signals that you are moving the conversation to a deeper level. Both applications are powerful. Step 4. Be silent after the disclosure. After sharing, stop talking. Let the norm of reciprocity activate. Don't fill the space. The pressure to match your disclosure is already operating. Give it room to produce. Step 5. Respond to their disclosure with full presence. When they share, receive it with genuine attention and no judgment. This is what confirms that your original disclosure was safe and that their reciprocal disclosure was the right choice. It builds the foundation for honesty going forward. Warning: how to recognize when it's used against you. Be thoughtful about the automatic pressure to match someone else's disclosed vulnerability. The impulse to reciprocate is healthy and social, but in a strategic context, it can be exploited. If someone shares a small, well-chosen vulnerability with you and then seems to wait intently for your response, ask yourself, is this genuine connection, or am I being invited to disclose something that will be useful to them? Real vulnerability is offered without agenda. Strategic vulnerability has a shape. It's just enough to open you, and no more. Part 2 has given you the tools to shape any conversation, to frame it, to lead it, to reset it, to deepen it, to guide it toward exactly where you need it to go. But the deepest level of influence doesn't happen in conversation at all. It happens underneath words entirely. Part 3 is where we go there.